Case 1. Kimberly Dawn Trenor. Spring in Galveston County, Texas, July 29, 2007. The summer heat bore down on Galveston Island as fishermen cast their lines into the murky waters of Galveston Bay on an October morning in 2007. The sun glinted off the waves, and boats dotted the horizon, a typical day on the Texas coast. But what these fishermen discovered floating near the shore would become one of Texas's most heartbreaking cases: a small plastic storage container, the kind you might use for holiday decorations or winter clothes, bobbing against the rocks near West Bay. At first, they thought it might be trash, another piece of debris washed up by the tide. But something about it caught their attention. The container was sealed, weighted, clearly placed in the water deliberately. When authorities arrived and carefully opened the sealed container, they found something no one could have imagined: the body of a toddler girl. She was dressed in pink and purple clothing, her blonde hair still visible despite the time in the water. Investigators carefully retrieved what they initially called Baby Grace because they had no idea who she was. No missing persons report matched her description, no frantic parents searching for a lost child. She was a mystery, a tiny victim without a name. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. This little girl had suffered horrific abuse before death: a fractured skull, multiple broken bones in various stages of healing, evidence of prolonged torture and systematic abuse. Someone had beaten this child repeatedly over an extended period. Someone had caused her immense pain and suffering. And then, someone had weighted down the container and dumped it in Galveston Bay, intending for it to never resurface, for this child to simply disappear without a trace. The case went cold for weeks. Investigators released sketches and descriptions, hoping someone would recognize the little girl. They checked missing persons databases, followed up on leads, interviewed anyone who might have information. Local and national media picked up the story. Who was Baby Grace? How did she end up in Galveston Bay? Where were her parents? Then, a tip came in from Ohio that would break the case wide open. A woman named Cheryl Sawyers called authorities with a gut-wrenching suspicion. Baby Grace might be her granddaughter, Riley and Sawyers. Cheryl explained that her daughter, Kimberly Dawn Trenor, had custody of 2-year-old Riley, but Cheryl hadn't been able to reach them in months. Every time she called, Kimberly had excuses. The phone wasn't working properly. They were busy. They'd call back later. Cheryl had been growing increasingly concerned, but now, seeing the news coverage of Baby Grace, a terrible recognition seized her heart. The clothing looked familiar. The description matched Riley's age. DNA testing confirmed Cheryl's worst fears. Baby Grace was indeed Riley and Sawyers, her beloved granddaughter. Investigators quickly located Kimberly Trenor and her husband, Royce Clyde Ziegler II, living in Spring, Texas, a suburb north of Houston. When confronted, their stories quickly fell apart. What emerged during interrogation painted a portrait of systematic torture masked as discipline, a campaign of abuse that escalated over time until it ended in murder. Kimberly admitted that she and Royce had subjected Riley to increasingly brutal punishments. According to their own statements and evidence gathered from their residence, the little girl was forced to stand in painful positions for hours at a time. She was denied food while the adults ate. She was beaten repeatedly with various objects. She was locked in closets. She was subjected to physical and psychological torture that would be considered war crimes if inflicted on enemy combatants. But this was a 2-year-old child being abused by her own mother and stepfather. On July 24, 2007, the abuse reached its fatal conclusion. According to testimony that would later be given in court, Royce became enraged at Riley for behavioral issues, likely nothing more than typical toddler behavior, but in his twisted mind, it warranted punishment. He began beating her head against various surfaces in their mobile home: walls, floors, furniture. Kimberly, rather than protecting her daughter, rather than grabbing Riley and running, rather than calling for help, participated in the violence. The details that emerged during the investigation were almost too horrible to comprehend. They held Riley's head underwater in a bathtub, drowning her. When the 2-year-old finally stopped breathing, when her small body went limp, they didn't call 911. They didn't rush her to the hospital. They didn't even give her a proper burial. Instead, they kept her body in a storage shed behind their mobile home for 1 to 2 months, letting it decompose in the Texas heat. During this time, they went about their daily lives as if nothing had happened. They ate meals, watched television, slept in their bed, all while Riley's body was deteriorating just steps away. When the body began to smell, when they feared discovery, they placed Riley in the plastic storage container, weighted it down with items to make it sink, and drove to Galveston Bay, where they dumped her into the water like garbage. They intended for Riley to disappear forever, to sink to the bottom of the bay where she would never be found, where no one would ever know what they had done. The trial revealed even more chilling details about Kimberly and Royce's relationship and mindset. Kimberly had given birth to Riley in Ohio and had another son from a previous relationship. Friends and family members who testified described her as unstable, someone who resented the responsibilities of motherhood, who saw her children as burdens rather than blessings. When she met Royce Ziegler online, their relationship quickly became toxic and violent. They fed off each other's worst impulses. Riley became the target of their combined rage. Text messages between the couple, recovered by investigators, showed a disturbing lack of remorse. They discussed the murder casually, as if they were talking about what to have for dinner or what movie to watch. They made plans for their future together as if Riley had never existed. Kimberly sent messages to family members claiming Riley was staying with friends or had gone to live with relatives, elaborate lies designed to cover up the unspeakable truth that Riley was dead, that she had been murdered by her own mother. In court, Kimberly showed minimal emotion as prosecutors presented the evidence against her. Photographs of Riley's injuries, testimony from the medical examiner about the extent of abuse she had suffered, evidence of the text messages and lies. All of it painted a picture of a woman who had completely abandoned any maternal instinct, any human compassion. The defense attempted to paint her as a victim of Royce's influence, suggesting that she had been coerced or manipulated into participating in the abuse. But the facts spoke otherwise. Kimberly had numerous opportunities to seek help, to take Riley to safety, to call the police, to tell a family member what was happening. She had opportunities to be the mother Riley needed, to protect her vulnerable toddler from harm. Instead, she chose violence. She chose to participate in torturing her own child. She chose to help dispose of Riley's body like trash. Prosecutors presented compelling evidence of premeditation and extreme cruelty. This wasn't a momentary loss of control, a single act of violence committed in the heat of anger. This was systematic, prolonged abuse culminating in murder and cover-up. This was calculated and deliberate. Royce Clyde Ziegler II was tried separately and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kimberly Dawn Trenor received the same sentence, life without parole. Both were convicted of capital murder, though prosecutors ultimately decided not to seek the death penalty, a decision that disappointed many who followed the case and felt that the brutality of Riley's death warranted the ultimate punishment. Riley's grandmother, Cheryl Sawyers, who had made the call that identified baby Grace, became an advocate for child abuse awareness. She channeled her grief into preventing similar tragedies, speaking at schools and community events, working with Child Protective Services, doing everything she could to honor Riley's memory by protecting other children. Cheryl lived with the knowledge that her own daughter had committed this horrible crime, a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. Riley and Sawyers was finally laid to rest in Ohio, far from the waters where her body had been discarded. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people who had never met her but had been moved by her story. She was buried in a small white casket, surrounded by flowers and stuffed animals. She was 2 years old when her life was stolen by the very people who should have protected her most, her mother and stepfather. The case prompted discussions about child welfare systems and whether more could have been done to identify Riley's abuse before it was too late. Had anyone noticed signs? Were there missed opportunities for intervention? These questions haunted social workers and child advocates who examined the case in its aftermath. If you see signs of child abuse in your community, unexplained injuries, behavioral changes, children who seem fearful or withdrawn, parents who isolate their children or give inconsistent explanations for injuries, please speak up. One call could save a life. Riley and Sawyers didn't have anyone to make that call for her, but other children might. Be their voice. And if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files to help us continue bringing awareness to these important cases. Case 2. Darlie Lynn Routier. Rowlett, Dallas County, Texas, June 6, 1996. The affluent Dallas suburb of Rowlett seemed like the perfect place to raise a family in the mid-1990s. Tree-lined streets wound through neighborhoods of brick homes with manicured lawns. Well-maintained parks dotted the community. Excellent schools drew families hoping to give their children every advantage. Crime was low. Community involvement was high. It was the kind of neighborhood where people felt safe, where children rode bicycles unsupervised, where doors were left unlocked. The Routier family appeared to embody the American dream that Rowlett represented. Darlie and Darren Routier lived in a beautiful two-story brick home on Eagle Drive. They had 3 young boys, Devin, 6 years old, Damon, 5 years old, and Drake, an infant. To outward appearances, they were living the suburban ideal, successful, attractive, thriving. That image shattered in the early morning hours of June 6, 1996. At 2:31 a.m., Darlie Routier's frantic voice came through to the 911 operator. The call itself would later become crucial evidence, analyzed by experts, played in court, dissected second by second. Darlie was screaming that an intruder had broken into her home and attacked her and her children. Her voice was panicked, desperate. She was crying and hyperventilating as she tried to explain what had happened. When police arrived at the brick 2-story home on Eagle Drive, they found a scene of carnage that would haunt even veteran officers. 6-year-old Devin Routier and 5-year-old Damon Routier had been stabbed multiple times with what appeared to be a large kitchen knife. The attacks were brutal and sustained. These weren't single stab wounds, but multiple deep penetrations that indicated rage and intent to kill. Emergency responders worked frantically to save the boys. They were rushed to Baylor University Medical Center in nearby Dallas, but their injuries were too severe. Both Devin and Damon were pronounced dead. The medical examiner would later testify that they had suffered wounds to vital organs, that death would have come quickly but not instantly, that these little boys had experienced moments of terror and pain before they died. Darlie herself had slash wounds on her neck and arm that required treatment. She was taken to the hospital where doctors stitched the wounds. She told police a harrowing story that seemed, at first, to explain the nightmare that had unfolded. According to Darlie, she had fallen asleep on the downstairs couch while her boys slept nearby on the floor, an impromptu slumber party in the family room where they had been watching television. She said she awakened to pressure on her body and realized someone was attacking her. She saw an intruder, dressed in dark clothing, standing over her. She fought back, struggling with him, but he stabbed her in the neck and arm. She screamed. She saw him attacking her children. She tried to protect them, but he was too strong, too fast. And then he fled, running through the kitchen and utility room before escaping through the garage. Her husband, Darren Routier, and their infant son, Drake, had been upstairs asleep and were unharmed. Darren told police he had been awakened by Darlie's screams, had run downstairs, and found the horrific scene, his wife injured, his 2 older sons stabbed and dying. The story seemed plausible at first. Home invasions happen. Random acts of violence occur. But as investigators processed the crime scene with meticulous care, inconsistencies began to emerge that would eventually unravel Darlie's account completely. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were secure. A window screen in the garage had been cut, supposedly the intruder's exit point, but forensic analysis indicated it had been cut from the inside, not the outside. The cut marks, the angle, the pattern, all suggested someone inside the house had damaged the screen to stage evidence of a break-in. The intruder's supposed escape route made no logical sense. According to Darlie's account, he had run through the kitchen, through the utility room, and out through the garage. But there was no trail of blood or evidence along this path that would be consistent with someone fleeing a crime scene in a panic. The physical evidence didn't support the story. Perhaps most puzzling was a bloody sock found in an alley 75 yards from the Routier house. The sock had blood from both Devin and Damon on it, but analysis suggested it had been placed there deliberately, not dropped during a frantic escape. Why would an intruder, fleeing after committing murder, run 75 yards down an alley to carefully place a sock? The scenario made no sense. Most damning was the blood evidence, which would become the prosecution's strongest argument. Blood spatter experts analyzed the patterns throughout the crime scene. The blood evidence indicated that Darlie's wounds were likely self-inflicted. The cuts were superficial compared to the deep, fatal wounds inflicted on the children. The angle and depth of her neck wound suggested she had cut herself. There were no defensive wounds of the type you would expect if she had truly fought with an intruder. Further investigation revealed what appeared to be cleaned-up blood in areas of the kitchen and utility room. Luminol testing, which reveals blood even after it has been washed away, showed patterns consistent with someone attempting to remove evidence. Darlie claimed she hadn't been in certain areas, but the blood evidence indicated otherwise. A bread knife from the Routier kitchen was identified as the murder weapon. It had been the knife used to stab Devon and Damon, and also to cut Darlie's neck and arm. The knife was found in the kitchen, not taken by the supposed intruder. Again, this made no sense if the story was true. Why would an intruder use the family's own knife, then leave it behind? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered information that provided possible motive. The Routiers, despite their upscale lifestyle and expensive home, were facing serious financial problems. They had significant debt. Darren's business was struggling. They were living beyond their means, presenting an image of success while the reality was quite different. Friends and acquaintances, when interviewed, painted a troubling picture of Darlie's state of mind in the months before the murders. She had been increasingly frustrated with motherhood, telling friends she felt overwhelmed by the demands of caring for 3 young boys. She had recently gotten breast implants despite their financial struggles, spending money they didn't have on cosmetic surgery. She appeared obsessed with her appearance, with maintaining a certain image, with recapturing the freedom and attention she had enjoyed before children. Then came what many considered the most damning evidence of all, the graveside video. Just 8 days after Devon and Damon were murdered and buried, Darlie held a birthday party at their graveside. It would have been Devon's 7th birthday. Rather than a somber memorial, the gathering included silly string being sprayed over the graves, laughter, and what appeared to be celebration rather than mourning. The local news media had filmed the event, and the video was later obtained by prosecutors and shown at trial. Jurors watched as Darlie, just over a week after her son's deaths, smiled and laughed while spraying silly string. To many, this behavior was incomprehensible. What grieving mother celebrates at her murdered children's graves? The defense would later argue that the video had been taken out of context, that there had been a somber prayer service earlier that wasn't filmed, that different people grieved differently. But the damage was done. The video became iconic, replayed endlessly in news coverage, cementing public opinion against Darlie. The prosecution's theory was devastating in its simplicity. Darlie Lynn Routier had murdered her 2 older sons because they were an inconvenience to the lifestyle she wanted. She resented the restrictions of motherhood. She was frustrated by financial problems that made her desired lifestyle impossible. She was focused on herself, her appearance, her desires, her needs, and saw her children as obstacles. The infant, Drake, was spared perhaps because he was too young to be perceived as a burden, or perhaps because killing 3 children would have been too obviously premeditated. By sparing the baby, she could maintain the fiction of being a loving mother while eliminating the 2 children who demanded the most time and energy. Darlie's trial began in January 1997 in Kerrville, Texas, where the venue had been moved due to intense publicity that made finding an impartial jury in Dallas County impossible. The trial lasted several weeks, and the evidence against Darlie was presented in methodical detail. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence, explaining how blood spatter patterns indicated what had actually happened versus what Darlie claimed had happened. They discussed the implausibility of her intruder story, pointing out inconsistency after inconsistency. They explained how her wounds appeared to be self-inflicted based on angle, depth, and location. The 911 call was played for the jury. Experts testified about whether Darlie's emotional response seemed genuine or staged. Some heard panic and grief. Others heard performance. The graveside video was shown, shocking jurors who struggled to reconcile the smiling woman spraying silly string with the grieving mother they expected to see. The defense argued that Darlie was innocent, that the evidence had been misinterpreted or mishandled, that she was a grieving mother being railroaded by overzealous prosecutors eager to close a high-profile case. They presented their own experts who disputed the blood evidence interpretation. They argued that grief manifests differently in different people and that the graveside video, shouldn't be used to judge her guilt or innocence. They pointed out that there was no clear motive. Why would a mother kill 2 of her 3 children? But the jury didn't buy it. The physical evidence was too strong. The inconsistencies in Darlie's story were too numerous. The behavior after the murders was too disturbing. After deliberating for several hours, they found Darlie Lynn Routier guilty of capital murder in the death of 5-year-old Damon. The penalty phase of the trial followed, where jurors had to decide between life in prison or death. They chose death. Darlie Lynn Routier was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She was never tried for Devon's murder. Prosecutors felt 1 death sentence was sufficient, and trying her for the second murder was unnecessary. She could always be tried for Devon's death later if the first conviction was overturned on appeal. Darlie has remained on death row for over 2 decades, one of only a handful of women on Texas's death row. She has maintained her innocence throughout, insisting that an intruder killed her sons and that she is a wrongfully convicted mother who lost everything. Her case has attracted supporters who believe she was wrongfully convicted. They point to what they see as flawed forensic evidence, inadequate defense, prosecutorial misconduct, and a rush to judgment. They argue that the blood evidence has been misinterpreted, that the graveside video was taken out of context, that the whole case was built on circumstantial evidence rather than proof beyond reasonable doubt. Multiple appeals have been filed over the years, all unsuccessful so far. DNA testing has been requested and conducted on various pieces of evidence, including the sock found in the alley and fingerprints lifted from the scene. Darlie's supporters hoped DNA evidence would identify the real killer and exonerate her. But so far, nothing has emerged that would exonerate her. The DNA testing has either been inconclusive or has actually supported the prosecution's case rather than undermining it. Meanwhile, Darren Routier initially stood by his wife, believing her story, supporting her through the investigation and trial. But over the years, his position has shifted. He eventually divorced Darlie, though the timing and reasons have been subject to speculation and controversy. He has given conflicting statements over the years about what he believes happened that night. Some interpret his statements as indicating he now believes Darlie is guilty. Others see a man still tormented by grief and confusion, unable to fully accept that his wife murdered their children. Drake Routier, the infant who survived that terrible night, grew up knowing his brothers were killed and his mother was convicted of their murders. He was raised by relatives, shielded as much as possible from media attention. He is now a young man, living with a burden few can imagine, the knowledge that his mother is on death row for killing his brothers. The Rowlett community was forever changed by the murders. The neighborhood on Eagle Drive, once the epitome of suburban safety, became a place of horror. The beautiful house where Devon and Damon died has been sold multiple times, with each owner aware of its dark history. Neighbors who once felt completely safe now locked their doors, installed security systems, and looked at each other with suspicion. Darlie Lynn Routier remains on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. The state of Texas maintains that justice was served, that the evidence overwhelmingly proved her guilt, that she murdered her own children in cold blood. Darlie's supporters continue fighting for her freedom, convinced she is innocent and that the real killer was never found. 2 little boys, Devon and Damon, never got to grow up. They never had the chance to play Little League or join the Boy Scouts. They never attended middle school or high school. They never went to prom, never graduated, never went to college. They never fell in love, never married, never had children of their own. Their lives, full of potential, were cut short in the most brutal way imaginable by someone they trusted completely, their own mother, if the jury verdict was correct. If you're struggling with parenting, if you're experiencing dark thoughts about harming yourself or your children, if you're feeling overwhelmed to the point of desperation, please reach out for help. Mental health resources are available, and seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Parenting is hard, and it's okay to admit when you need support. What's not okay is letting those feelings escalate to violence. There are people who want to help, professionals who can provide the intervention and support you need. Please use them. If you're following along with True Crime Silent Files and want to see more verified cases like this presented with thorough analysis and respect for the victims, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comment section below, and subscribe to our channel. Case 3. Deanna Laney. New Chapel Hill, Smith County, Texas, May 10, 2003. In the rural community of New Chapel Hill, located about 100 miles east of Dallas in Smith County, the pace of life was slower, more traditional, more deeply rooted in religious faith than in the urban centers of Texas. New Chapel Hill wasn't even really a town. It was more a collection of homes and farms spread across quiet country roads, with a few churches serving as community anchors. The Laney family was well known in this small community as devoutly religious people. Deanna Laney, a 38-year-old stay-at-home mother, was active in her local Assembly of God church. She homeschooled her children, teaching them not just academics, but also deep religious principles. She seemed devoted to her family, committed to raising her boys in a godly home. Her husband, Keith Laney, worked as a minister, further cementing the family's reputation as pillars of the faith community. They had 3 sons, 8-year-old Joshua, 6-year-old Luke, and 14-month-old Aaron. The boys were well-behaved, polite, and seemed to be thriving under their mother's homeschooling regimen. On the night of May 10, 2003, Keith was away at work. He often worked night shifts. Deanna was alone with the boys at their modest home on a quiet country road surrounded by farmland and woods. It was a peaceful setting, the kind of place where you could hear crickets and see stars unpolluted by city lights. What happened that night would be described by investigators as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever witnessed in their careers. Around 11:30 p.m., Deanna called 911. Unlike many 911 calls from people who have just committed horrible crimes, Deanna's voice was eerily calm, almost flat in its effect. She told the dispatcher, simply and directly, "I just killed my boys." The dispatcher, confused and hoping she had misheard, asked her to repeat herself. Deanna calmly stated again that she had killed her sons. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the rural home, racing down the dark country road with sirens blazing, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. 8-year-old Joshua and 6-year-old Luke were in the front yard, lying on the ground near the driveway. Their skulls had been crushed by heavy rocks that lay nearby, covered in blood and brain matter. Deanna had methodically bludgeoned them to death, striking them repeatedly with stones until they stopped moving. Inside the house, 14-month-old Aaron was found alive but critically injured in his crib. His skull had also been fractured. Deanna had struck the baby with a rock as well, but either she had been interrupted or had been unable to complete the murder. The infant was rushed to a hospital in critical condition, his life hanging in the balance. Deanna was waiting for police when they arrived. She was covered in her son's blood, on her hands, her clothes, her face. She made no attempt to flee or resist arrest. She didn't try to hide what she had done or claim an intruder had attacked her children. Instead, she calmly explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that God had commanded her to kill her children. She said she had received direct orders from God, that this was a test of her faith similar to the biblical story of Abraham being told to sacrifice his son Isaac. She believed she was doing God's will, following divine commands that superseded all human law and morality. In her mind, she was being obedient to the highest possible authority. The community was stunned. This wasn't a stranger, wasn't someone on the margins of society. The Laneys were well-known, well-liked, respected members of the community. Deanna was considered a devoted mother and faithful Christian. Keith was a minister. How could this happen? How could a mother who seemed so loving, so dedicated to her children, commit such an atrocity? As details emerged, a picture developed of a woman experiencing a severe psychotic break, though tragically, no one had recognized the warning signs or understood the depth of her delusions until it was too late. In the weeks and months before the murders, Deanna had become increasingly obsessed with religious extremism and end-times theology. She told people she was receiving messages directly from God about the approaching apocalypse. She believed the end times were imminent, that Satan was actively working in the world, that spiritual warfare was intensifying. She began to believe her sons were being attacked by demonic forces. She thought she was receiving divine instructions about how to protect them, how to save their souls. Her grip on reality had progressively loosened, but to those around her in the conservative religious community, she seemed like a devoted, if perhaps overly zealous, Christian mother. The line between deep faith and delusion had blurred, and no one recognized that Deanna had crossed it. Laney was absolutely devastated when he learned what had happened. He had been at work, earning money to support his family, when his wife murdered 2 of their sons and attempted to kill the third. He told investigators he had noticed Deanna becoming more intense about religion in recent weeks, more focused on prophecy and spiritual warfare, but he never imagined she was capable of violence. He had interpreted her increasing religious fervor as spiritual growth, not mental illness. Deanna was charged with 2 counts of capital murder for the deaths of Joshua and Luke, plus attempted capital murder for the attack on Aaron. The question facing prosecutors was whether to seek the death penalty against a woman who was clearly experiencing severe mental illness at the time of the crimes. The case brought intense attention to the intersection of religious extremism, mental health, and the criminal justice system. How do we distinguish between genuine religious faith and psychotic delusion? When does spiritual belief become mental illness? And how should the legal system respond when someone commits murder based on what they believe are divine commands? Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Deanna was suffering from psychotic delusions at the time of the murders. Multiple experts, both for the prosecution and defense, examined her and reached similar conclusions. She met the legal definition of insanity. She was unable to distinguish right from wrong due to mental disease. Her delusions were so powerful, so all-consuming, that she genuinely believed God was commanding her actions and that she had a divine obligation to obey. The trial took place in 2004 in Smith County. The courtroom was packed with community members, media, and people from across Texas who wanted to understand how this could happen. The prosecution presented the horrific facts of the case. 2 young boys bludgeoned to death with rocks, an infant critically injured, all at the hands of their own mother. But the prosecution didn't focus heavily on seeking vengeance. They acknowledged the reality of Deanna's mental illness. The defense presented expert witness after expert witness who described her mental state in clinical terms. Psychotic disorder with religious delusions, complete break with reality, inability to appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. Testimony revealed she had no motive beyond her delusional belief that God wanted her to kill her children. She had no history of violence toward her sons or anyone else. She had no rational reason to harm them. No insurance policies, no custody disputes, no abuse allegations, none of the typical motives seen in filicide cases. The only explanation was psychosis, pure and simple. The jury faced a difficult and painful decision. The law in Texas, as in most states, provides an insanity defense, but it's rarely successful. Juries are often deeply skeptical of insanity claims, seeing them as attempts to avoid responsibility for heinous acts. But in Deanna Laney's case, the evidence of her psychosis was overwhelming and undeniable. After careful deliberation, weighing the terrible facts of the murders against the clear evidence of severe mental illness, the jury returned a verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Deanna was committed to a state psychiatric hospital rather than sent to prison. Under Texas law, she would remain hospitalized indefinitely until mental health professionals determined she was no longer a danger to herself or others. Her commitment had no fixed endpoint. She could theoretically remain institutionalized for the rest of her life if she remained dangerous, or she could eventually be released to outpatient treatment if she responded well to medication and therapy. Joshua and Luke Laney were buried in a small cemetery in East Texas in a quiet ceremony attended by family members, church members, and community residents who struggled to comprehend the tragedy. The boys' Sunday school teachers spoke about their sweet dispositions and bright smiles. Friends of the family grieved not just for the boys but for Keith, who had lost so much in one terrible night. Aaron, the youngest, survived his injuries but sustained permanent brain damage from the blow to his skull. The 14-month-old required extensive medical care and would face developmental challenges throughout his life. He was raised by his father, Keith, who eventually remarried and tried to build a new life while carrying the weight of unbearable loss. Keith Laney showed remarkable grace and forgiveness toward his wife, publicly stating that he recognized she had been mentally ill and that the person who killed their sons was not the woman he had married, but someone whose mind had been destroyed by psychosis. His compassion in the face of such tragedy moved many people, though others couldn't understand how he could forgive. In 2012, after nearly a decade of intensive psychiatric treatment, Deanna Laney was granted outpatient status. This meant she could live outside the psychiatric hospital under strict supervision, taking medication, attending therapy, and being monitored by mental health professionals. This decision sparked significant controversy. Some people believed she had been successfully treated, that her psychosis was controlled by medication, and that she deserved a chance to rebuild some semblance of a life under carefully monitored conditions. They pointed out that she had never been violent before her psychotic break and had responded well to treatment. Others felt she should remain institutionalized for the rest of her life regardless of her mental health status. They argued that releasing someone who killed 2 children, even under supervision, was inappropriate and disrespectful to the victims. They worried about public safety and questioned whether someone who had committed such acts could ever truly be safe in society. The Deanna Laney case raised important and difficult questions that continue to challenge legal scholars, mental health professionals, ethicists, and ordinary citizens. Should someone experiencing a psychotic break be held criminally responsible for their actions in the same way as someone who commits murder while fully rational? How do we balance justice for victims with recognition that mental illness can completely destroy a person's grasp on reality and moral reasoning? Can someone who commits murder while psychotic ever be truly rehabilitated? These questions have no easy answers. The community of New Chapel Hill, small and close-knit, struggled with the aftermath of the case for years. The Laney tragedy brought unwanted media attention and forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about mental illness, religious extremism, and the potential for violence that can exist even in the most seemingly peaceful and faithful communities. Some churches and religious communities engaged in self-examination, asking whether they needed to do better at recognizing when religious fervor crosses into mental illness, when spiritual experiences become psychotic delusions, when someone claiming to hear from God needs psychiatric help rather than prayer alone. If you or someone you know is experiencing delusions, hearing voices, seeing visions, or having extreme religious fixations that seem detached from reality, please seek immediate mental health intervention. Psychosis is a medical emergency that requires professional treatment. Early intervention with appropriate medication and therapy can prevent tragedies. Faith and mental health care are not mutually exclusive. Responsible religious communities recognize that mental illness is real and that seeking psychiatric help is appropriate and necessary, not a failure of faith. Please like this video, leave a comment with your respectful thoughts, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Your engagement helps these crucial stories reach a wider audience and potentially prevents future tragedies. Case 4, Lisa and Diaz. Plano, Collin County, Texas, August 8, 2003. Plano, an upscale suburb located north of Dallas in Collin County, was known throughout Texas and nationally as one of the best places to raise a family. The city boasted excellent schools consistently ranked among the top in the state, safe neighborhoods with virtually no violent crime, abundant parks and recreational facilities, and a thriving economy that attracted educated, affluent families. The median household income was well above the state average. Homes were large and well-maintained. The community invested heavily in youth programs, libraries, and family services. If you wanted to give your children every advantage, Plano seemed like the perfect choice. The Diaz family lived in a comfortable home in one of Plano's pleasant subdivisions. Lisa and Diaz, a 34-year-old stay-at-home mother, cared for her 2 young daughters while her husband worked to support the family. From the outside, they appeared to be living the suburban dream. Comfortable home, 2 beautiful children, financial stability, a place in a great community. On August 8, 2003, that image of suburban tranquility was shattered completely. Emergency responders received a frantic call from the Diaz residence. The details were confused and alarming. Something about children in a bathtub, something terrible had happened. When paramedics and police arrived at the home, they found a scene that would haunt them for years. Lisa's 2 daughters, 5-year-old Christina and 2-year-old Brianna, were dead, drowned in the upstairs bathtub. Their small bodies were still in the water when first responders arrived. Desperate attempts at resuscitation were made, but it was too late. The girls had been underwater too long. They were pronounced dead at the scene. Lisa herself was found in the master bedroom, having attempted suicide by slashing her wrists and taking an overdose of medication. She was unconscious but alive. She was immediately rushed to a hospital where medical teams worked to save her life, treating the overdose, repairing the damage to her wrists, stabilizing her condition. As Lisa recovered physically in the hospital, kept under police guard, investigators began piecing together what had happened in that Plano home. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Lisa had deliberately drowned both of her daughters in the bathtub, holding them underwater until they stopped breathing, then attempted to take her own life. The question that haunted everyone was, why? Why would a mother do this? As investigators dug deeper, interviewing friends, family members, and Lisa's healthcare providers, they discovered that Lisa had been suffering from severe postpartum depression and psychosis for months, possibly years. This wasn't a sudden snap, a momentary loss of control. This was a serious mental illness that had been developing and worsening over time. Friends and family members would later testify that they had noticed changes in Lisa's behavior and demeanor. She seemed withdrawn, pulling back from social activities she used to enjoy. She seemed anxious, constantly worried about things that didn't seem to warrant such concern. She sometimes seemed confused or disconnected, staring off into space, not fully present in conversations. But postpartum depression often goes unrecognized or is dismissed as baby blues or normal adjustment challenges. Many people noticed Lisa seemed off, but no one realized the depth of her mental illness. No one understood that she was experiencing psychosis, that her perception of reality was becoming increasingly distorted. Once Lisa was medically stable and able to communicate with investigators and psychiatrists, a fuller picture emerged of her mental state on the day she drowned her daughters. She told psychiatrists that she had been hearing voices for weeks or months, voices telling her terrible things, commanding her to do things, predicting horrible futures. The voices told her that her daughters would suffer terribly if they continued living. They told her that Christina and Brianna would experience abuse, pain, trauma, and misery as they grew up. They told her that the world was a dangerous, evil place, and that her daughters would be victims of that evil. She described feeling completely disconnected from reality, unable to trust her own perceptions, overwhelmed by the voices and visions. In her psychotic mind, drowning her daughters became an act of mercy, a way to save them from future suffering. She genuinely believed she was protecting them, not harming them. This is one of the most tragic aspects of postpartum psychosis. Mothers who kill their children while psychotic often believe they are saving them, protecting them from some perceived threat. Their maternal instinct to protect hasn't disappeared. It's been horribly distorted by psychosis into something unrecognizable. The case drew immediate comparisons to Andrea Yates, the Houston mother who had drowned her 5 children in 2001, just 2 years before Lisa's crime. Both women suffered from severe postpartum psychosis. Both committed their crimes during acute psychotic episodes. Both believed they were somehow saving their children by killing them. Both cases raised urgent questions about how society identifies and treats maternal mental illness. Lisa was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The prosecution faced the same difficult dilemma they had faced in other cases involving clear mental illness. Should they seek the death penalty against a woman who was obviously, profoundly mentally ill at the time of the crime? Is that justice? Or is that punishing someone for being sick? Psychiatric evaluations were extensive and unanimous. Every expert who examined Lisa, whether hired by the prosecution or the defense, reached the same conclusion. She had been experiencing severe postpartum psychosis at the time she drowned Christina and Brianna. Postpartum psychosis is a rare but devastating mental illness that affects approximately 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 women who give birth. It typically emerges within the first few weeks after delivery, though it can develop later. Symptoms include hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that aren't there, delusions, fixed false beliefs, severe confusion, and rapid mood changes. Women experiencing postpartum psychosis may believe their babies are possessed, that they need to kill their children to save them from Satan, or that their children would be better off dead. It's important to understand that postpartum psychosis is completely different from postpartum depression, though the names sound similar. Postpartum depression is much more common and involves symptoms like sadness, anxiety, difficulty bonding with the baby, and feelings of inadequacy. It's serious and requires treatment, but it rarely involves psychotic symptoms. Postpartum psychosis is a psychiatric emergency. Women experiencing it are at high risk of harming themselves or their children. They need immediate hospitalization and treatment with antipsychotic medication. With proper treatment, the prognosis is actually quite good. Most women recover fully and never experience another psychotic episode. But without treatment, the consequences can be catastrophic, as Lisa's case demonstrated. Experts testified at Lisa's trial that she genuinely believed she was protecting her daughters when she drowned them. Her mental disease was so profound that she couldn't understand the wrongfulness of her actions. She thought she was doing the right thing, the loving thing, the necessary thing to protect Christina and Brianna from future harm. The trial focused heavily on Lisa's mental state rather than disputing the facts of what she had done. The prosecution didn't question that she had drowned her daughters. The evidence was indisputable. But they had to consider whether she met the legal definition of insanity, which requires that the defendant, due to mental disease, didn't know their actions were wrong. The defense presented expert after expert explaining postpartum psychosis, its symptoms, its effects on judgment and perception, its ability to completely distort reality. They explained that this isn't something a person chooses, isn't a moral failing or weakness. It's a medical condition, a malfunction in brain chemistry that requires treatment just like any other serious illness. Ultimately, after hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury concluded that Lisa and Diaz was legally insane at the time she drowned Christina and Brianna. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a state psychiatric facility for treatment. The verdict meant Lisa would not go to prison. Instead, she would receive psychiatric treatment in a hospital setting until mental health professionals determined she was no longer a danger to herself or others. Some people supported this outcome, believing it was the appropriate response to someone who committed murder while psychotic. Others felt frustrated, believing Lisa should be in prison regardless of her mental state. Lisa's husband faced incomprehensible loss and impossible emotions. He had lost both his daughters in the most horrible way imaginable. He had nearly lost his wife to suicide, and he had to grapple with the knowledge that his wife had killed their children, even though mental illness was the cause. In statements to the media and in court, he expressed both profound grief for his daughters and compassion for his wife. He told reporters that he had noticed Lisa struggling in the months before the drownings, but he hadn't fully understood how serious her condition was. He wished he had recognized the signs of postpartum psychosis, wished he had insisted she get help, wished he had done something to prevent the tragedy. His response highlighted how difficult it can be for family members to recognize postpartum psychosis, especially when they don't know what warning signs to look for. Lisa's symptoms had developed gradually. To her husband, she seemed stressed and tired, which seemed normal for a mother of young children. He didn't realize she was experiencing psychosis until it was too late. The case brought renewed and intense attention to postpartum mental health. Advocates pointed out that postpartum depression and psychosis are medical conditions that require medical treatment, not moral failings or signs of weakness. They emphasized that the vast majority of women suffering from postpartum mental illness never harm their children. But when proper treatment isn't available or isn't recognized as necessary, the consequences can be catastrophic. Organizations dedicated to maternal mental health used Lisa's case to push for better screening, more awareness, and improved access to treatment. They called for routine mental health screening for all new mothers, education for family members about warning signs, and quick access to psychiatric care when needed. Collin County responded by improving its postpartum mental health resources, making screening more routine, and educating healthcare providers about how to identify and treat postpartum psychosis before it escalates to crisis. Lisa and Diaz remained in psychiatric care for years, receiving intensive treatment for her psychosis and depression. Reports from mental health professionals indicated she eventually gained insight into what she had done, meaning the psychosis cleared, the medication worked, and she came to understand with horrifying clarity that she had drowned her own daughters. This insight, while a sign of successful treatment, brought its own agonizing burden. Lisa had to live with the knowledge of what she had done, even though she had been psychotic at the time. The grief, guilt, and remorse were crushing. She required ongoing therapy not just for the psychosis, but for the trauma of having committed such acts while mentally ill. The legal system had determined she was not criminally responsible due to insanity, But that legal finding didn't absolve her of the emotional weight of having killed Christina and Brianna. She would carry that burden for the rest of her life. Christina and Brianna Diaz were remembered by their extended family, by their father, and by the Plano community as bright, happy little girls whose lives were tragically cut short. Their deaths became a catalyst for improved postpartum mental health screening and awareness in Collin County and beyond. The Plano community, like other affluent communities that have experienced maternal filicide, had to confront the reality that mental illness doesn't discriminate based on zip code, income level, or education. Even in the wealthiest, most educated, most resource-rich communities, women can suffer from debilitating postpartum mental illness without receiving adequate help. The assumption that this kind of thing doesn't happen here is dangerous because it prevents communities from recognizing warning signs and providing necessary support. Mental illness can affect anyone, anywhere, regardless of socioeconomic status. If you're a new mother experiencing disturbing thoughts, extreme anxiety, feelings of unreality, voices or visions that others don't experience, or thoughts of harming yourself or your baby, please tell your doctor immediately. Don't be embarrassed. Don't minimize what you're experiencing. Don't wait to see if it gets better on its own. Postpartum psychosis is a medical emergency that requires immediate intervention. Treatment is available, highly effective, and could save lives, yours and your child's. There is no shame in mental illness, and seeking help is the most responsible, loving thing you can do for yourself and your family. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Case 5, Melissa Towne. Tomball, Harris County, Texas, September 26, 2022. Tomball, a growing community northwest of Houston in Harris County, has evolved over the decades from a small railroad town into a bustling suburb. With its charming historic downtown, excellent schools, and proximity to Houston's employment opportunities, Tomball attracted families looking for small-town charm with big city access. The community prided itself on being a safe, welcoming place where neighbors knew each other and looked out for one another. Melissa Towne lived in Tomball with her 5-year-old daughter, whose name was withheld from most media reports to protect her identity and dignity, even in death. To outward appearances, Melissa was a struggling single mother doing her best to raise her daughter alone. Single motherhood is challenging under the best circumstances, and Melissa faced her share of difficulties, financial stress, limited support systems, and the everyday exhaustion of being solely responsible for a young child. Neighbors who lived near Melissa's modest home described occasional interactions with her and her daughter. The little girl seemed like a typical kindergartner, energetic, curious, sometimes shy around strangers, but warming up quickly. Melissa seemed tired, often stressed, but that wasn't unusual for a single working mother. Nothing about their situation seemed to predict the horror that was coming. On September 26, 2022, Melissa walked into a hospital emergency room, carrying her daughter. The medical staff immediately recognized that something was terribly wrong. The child wasn't breathing. She wasn't moving. Melissa placed her daughter's small body on the counter and told the shocked staff that her daughter was hurt, that she needed help. Hospital personnel immediately began emergency protocols, checking for vital signs, attempting resuscitation. But it was quickly apparent that the child was beyond help. She had been dead for some time before Melissa brought her to the hospital. And her injuries were not accidental. She had been stabbed multiple times. Security called police while medical staff continued their futile attempts to revive the child. When officers arrived and began questioning Melissa, she made no attempt to lie about what she had done. She admitted to investigators, with disturbing calmness, that she had stabbed her daughter to death at their home earlier that day. She had then placed the child's body in her vehicle and driven to the hospital. The confession was chilling in its directness. There was no attempt to claim an intruder, no suggestion of an accident, no complex story designed to deflect blame. Melissa simply acknowledged that she had killed her own daughter. But even more disturbing than the confession was Melissa's explanation for why she had committed this unspeakable act. She told investigators that demons had commanded her to kill her daughter. She described hearing voices that weren't coming from any identifiable source, voices that she believed were demonic entities. She saw visions and experienced what she described as spiritual attacks. In Melissa's psychotic mind, Her daughter was either possessed by demons or in danger from demonic forces. The voices told her that killing her daughter was necessary, that it was the only way to protect the child or to obey the demonic commands. Her grip on reality had been so thoroughly destroyed by psychosis that murder seemed not just justified but required. Investigators went to Melissa's home in Tombole and found the crime scene, a small, modest house where a little girl's life had ended in violence. The evidence confirmed every detail of Melissa's confession. Her daughter had been stabbed multiple times in what appeared to be a sustained, brutal attack. The wounds indicated she had suffered before dying. The scene showed signs of someone living in mental distress, disorganized space, evidence of erratic behavior, indications that Melissa's psychological deterioration had been ongoing. Neighbors, when questioned, recalled that Melissa had seemed increasingly strange in recent weeks, talking to herself, appearing agitated for no obvious reason, making odd statements that didn't quite make sense. Melissa was arrested and charged with capital murder. But even in the immediate aftermath, it was abundantly clear to investigators, prosecutors, and eventually defense attorneys that severe mental illness played a central role in this tragedy. Melissa's statements about demons and voices indicated she was experiencing acute psychosis. As the case proceeded through the Harris County legal system, psychiatric experts conducted extensive evaluations of Melissa. The findings were consistent across multiple independent evaluations. She suffered from severe mental illness, including psychotic disorder and possible schizophrenia that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. Schizophrenia is a serious mental illness characterized by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, and impaired functioning. People with untreated schizophrenia may hear voices, see things that aren't there, and develop false beliefs that feel absolutely real to them. The voices can be commanding, telling the person to do things. The delusions can be all-consuming, completely rewriting the person's perception of reality. At the time of the murder, experts determined Melissa was experiencing acute psychosis. She genuinely believed demonic forces were real, were threatening her daughter, and were commanding her actions. Her delusions were so powerful that, in her distorted perception, stabbing her child was an act that made sense within her psychotic worldview. This doesn't excuse what she did or minimize the horror of a 5-year-old child being murdered by her own mother, but it explains the legal question that would become central to her case. Did Melissa understand that killing her daughter was wrong? Could someone experiencing such severe psychosis be held criminally responsible in the same way as someone who commits murder while fully rational? The case proceeded to trial in 2023. Harris County prosecutors presented the undisputed facts. Melissa Towne had stabbed her 5-year-old daughter to death in a brutal attack. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Melissa's own confession eliminated any question about who had committed the crime. The defense didn't dispute these facts. Instead, they argued that Melissa was legally insane at the time of the murder, unable to distinguish right from wrong due to severe mental illness. They presented the psychiatric evaluations, expert testimony about psychosis and schizophrenia, and evidence of Melissa's deteriorating mental state in the weeks and months before the killing. The jury heard testimony about Melissa's mental health history. She had struggled with mental illness for years, experiencing symptoms that suggested psychotic disorder or schizophrenia. But she had not consistently received treatment for various reasons: financial constraints that made regular psychiatric care unaffordable, lack of health insurance that would cover mental health services, the stigma surrounding mental illness that prevented her from seeking help, and the fragmented mental health care system that made continuity of care nearly impossible for someone in her circumstances. Mental health professionals testified that if Melissa had received appropriate treatment, regular psychiatric care, antipsychotic medication, therapy, and monitoring, her psychosis could have been controlled. She likely would never have harmed her daughter. The medication and treatment that could have prevented this tragedy existed and was effective, but Melissa hadn't been able to access it. This raised uncomfortable questions about society's responsibility in preventing such tragedies. Yes, Melissa was the one who committed the murder. But did society fail her and her daughter by not providing accessible mental health care? Should mental health treatment be as readily available as treatment for physical illnesses? How many tragedies could be prevented if people with serious mental illness could easily access the care they need? After hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury deliberated on Melissa's fate. They had to decide whether she was criminally responsible for killing her daughter or whether her psychosis meant she couldn't appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. The jury found Melissa Towne not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for treatment, where she would remain until mental health professionals determined she was no longer a danger to herself or others. The verdict meant Melissa would receive psychiatric treatment rather than imprisonment. For some, this was the appropriate outcome, recognizing that punishing someone for actions committed while psychotic doesn't serve justice and doesn't prevent future tragedies. For others, the verdict was frustrating, feeling that regardless of mental illness, someone who killed a child should be in prison. The case highlighted ongoing, systemic problems with mental health care access in Texas and across the United States. Texas has particularly struggled with mental health services. The state has historically ranked poorly in mental health care access, with limited psychiatric beds, long wait lists for services, and significant gaps in coverage for low-income individuals. Melissa's psychosis hadn't developed overnight. There had been warning signs, periods when intervention could have prevented the tragedy. But she fell through the cracks of a system that often fails to provide adequate care for those who need it most desperately. She couldn't afford regular psychiatric care. She didn't have insurance that covered mental health treatment. She didn't know where to turn for help. And so her psychosis went untreated, worsening over time, until it culminated in the murder of her daughter. Her 5-year-old daughter's death was completely preventable. With proper mental health treatment, Melissa's psychosis could have been managed with medication and therapy. Her daughter would still be alive, starting first grade, making friends, learning to read, experiencing the joy of childhood. Instead, that little girl died at her mother's hands in a brutal attack driven by untreated psychosis. The Harris County community where this occurred responded with grief for the innocent child lost and frustration that mental health resources remain so inadequate that tragedies like this continue to occur despite being entirely preventable. Child advocacy groups pointed out that children of parents with severe mental illness are particularly vulnerable and need protection. Advocates called for better screening to identify parents experiencing psychosis, more accessible mental health services that don't require insurance or significant out-of-pocket costs, and intervention programs specifically designed to protect children in households where a parent is experiencing severe mental illness. Melissa Towne's daughter deserved better. She deserved a mother who was mentally healthy and capable of caring for her. She deserved a society that ensured her mother could access the mental health treatment that would have kept her safe. She deserved to live, to grow up, to have a future. If you know someone exhibiting signs of psychosis, hearing voices that others don't hear, seeing things that aren't there, expressing bizarre beliefs that seem detached from reality, behaving in ways that are dramatically different from their normal personality, please help them get immediate psychiatric evaluation. Psychosis is treatable with medication and therapy, but only if it's recognized and addressed. Early intervention can prevent tragedies. Don't wait, don't assume it will get better on its own, and don't be deterred by the person's resistance to help. Your intervention could save their life and the lives of those around them. If you're finding value in these thoroughly researched cases from True Crime Silent Files, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to our channel. We're dedicated to bringing you verified true crime stories presented with accuracy, depth, and respect for the victims and their families. Case 6, Shamaiya Hall, Italy, Ellis County, Texas, March 17, 2023. The small town of Italy, Texas, located in Ellis County about 50 miles south of Dallas, is the kind of rural community where life moves at a slower pace. With a population just under 2,000 residents, Italy retains the character of small-town America. A main street with local businesses, churches that serve as community hubs, schools where teachers know every student by name, and neighborhoods where children play outside under the watchful eyes of caring adults. In towns like Italy, people know their neighbors. They attend the same churches, shop at the same stores, and support the local school football team together. There's a sense of safety and community that larger cities often lack. Serious violent crime is rare, almost unthinkable in a place where everyone knows everyone else. That sense of safety and security was shattered on the morning of March 17th, 2023, when deputies from the Ellis County Sheriff's Office responded to a disturbing call from a residence in Italy. The dispatcher's voice was tense as she relayed the information to responding units. Multiple victims, children involved, possible homicide. When deputies arrived at the house, a modest home in a quiet residential area, they found a scene of unthinkable violence that would haunt even the most experienced law enforcement officers. 5 children had been stabbed, attacked while they slept or shortly after waking when they were most vulnerable and defenseless. 3 of the children, twin boys and their older sister, were dead. Their young lives ended in a brutal attack. 2 other children had survived but were critically injured, suffering from multiple stab wounds that required immediate emergency medical intervention. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize the surviving children while deputies secured the scene and began their investigation. The children ranged in age from infant to preteen. They had been attacked with a knife in what appeared to be a sustained, deliberate assault. Medical examiners would later testify that the children had suffered multiple wounds, indicating a prolonged and brutal attack rather than a momentary loss of control. This was not a single impulsive act, but a sustained campaign of violence against helpless children. The victim's mother, 28-year-old Shamaiya Hall, was at the scene when deputies arrived. She had been the one to call the authorities after the attack, summoning help once the violence was over. She made no attempt to flee, no effort to claim an intruder had been responsible, no elaborate story designed to deflect blame. Shamaiya was immediately taken into custody and transported to the Ellis County Jail. She was charged with 3 counts of capital murder for the deaths of the 3 children and 2 counts of attempted capital murder for the attacks on the surviving children. If convicted on all counts, she faced either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. The investigation into what drove Shamaiya to commit such a horrific act revealed a complex and troubling picture of her life and circumstances. Neighbors and acquaintances, when interviewed by investigators, described her as a devoted mother who seemed to love her children. They had seen her playing with them in the yard, taking them to the park, appearing affectionate and caring. But closer examination revealed a woman under enormous pressure, facing multiple crises simultaneously with limited support systems to help her cope. Shamaiya had recently lost her job, eliminating her primary source of income and throwing the family's finances into chaos. Without steady employment, she was struggling to pay rent, buy groceries, and meet the basic needs of 5 children. She was facing eviction from her home, with notices posted on her door threatening to force the family onto the street. The stress of potential homelessness, particularly with 5 young children, would be overwhelming for anyone. Financial pressures were mounting daily. Unpaid bills, overdue rent, empty refrigerator, utilities at risk of being shut off. Shamaiya was a single mother without significant family support nearby. She was isolated, dealing with these mounting crises largely alone. Friends and family who lived in other areas weren't aware of how desperate her situation had become. She had been too proud or too overwhelmed to reach out for help, to ask for assistance, to admit she was drowning. Some reports suggested she may have been experiencing mental health issues as well, though this was less clear-cut than in cases involving obvious psychosis. During interviews with investigators and court-appointed mental health experts, Shamaiya made statements suggesting she had felt overwhelmed, hopeless, and trapped with no way out of her circumstances. She expressed that she saw no future for herself or her children, that she felt incapable of providing for them, that she believed they would be better off dead than facing poverty, homelessness, and suffering. Whether these feelings constituted legal insanity or were instead the thoughts of a desperate, depressed woman facing impossible circumstances remained a central question as the case proceeded. The distinction is legally important. Depression, even severe depression, doesn't automatically meet the legal standard for insanity unless it involves psychotic features like delusions or hallucinations that prevent the person from understanding right from wrong. Feeling hopeless and desperate, while tragic, doesn't constitute legal insanity if the person still understands that killing is wrong. The case proceeded through the Ellis County court system with intense media attention and public interest. Prosecutors argued that Shamaiya had made a calculated, conscious decision to kill her children rather than face the difficulties of single motherhood and poverty. The violence of the attacks, they contended, showed intent and awareness of what she was doing. She knew stabbing her children would kill them. She knew it was wrong. She chose to do it anyway. The defense team had Shamaiya evaluated by mental health experts to assess her psychological state at the time of the murders and determine whether she might have a viable insanity defense. Some professionals found evidence of severe depression and acute stress, but opinions differed significantly on whether she met the legal standard for insanity. Unlike Deanna Laney or Lisa Diaz, Shamaiya wasn't hearing voices commanding her to kill. She wasn't experiencing delusions that her children were possessed by demons or that God was testing her faith. Her mental state was more ambiguous, falling into a gray area that's more difficult for the legal system to address. She was clearly suffering. Depression, desperation, hopelessness, and acute stress were all evident. But did those conditions rise to the level of legal insanity? Did they prevent her from knowing that killing her children was wrong? Or was she a desperate woman who made a horrific choice while still understanding the wrongfulness of her actions? As of the most recent reports available, the case remained in the legal system, working its way through pretrial proceedings. Shamaiya Hall was being held without bond in the Ellis County Jail, awaiting trial on multiple counts of capital murder. Her court-appointed attorneys were preparing her defense while prosecutors built their case. The two surviving children, having recovered from their physical wounds as much as possible, were placed in the care of relatives who could provide a safe, stable home. They faced not only the physical scars from the stab wounds, but profound psychological trauma from what they had experienced and witnessed. These children had lost 3 of their siblings in a violent attack. They had been attacked themselves by their own mother. They would need extensive therapy and support to process the trauma, to rebuild any sense of safety and trust, to have hope for a future after experiencing such horror at such a young age. The town of Italy was devastated by the tragedy. In a community of less than 2,000 people, the murder of 3 children and the attempted murder of 2 others sent shockwaves through every family, every church, every school. Children who had gone to school with Shamaiya's kids struggled to understand why their classmates were gone, why this had happened in their safe, small town. Teachers, coaches, and neighbors who had known the family mourned the loss of 3 young lives cut short. They grappled with guilt, wondering if there were signs they had missed, opportunities to intervene that they hadn't recognized. Could someone have helped Shamaiya before she reached the breaking point? Could the children have been saved if someone had noticed the family's desperation? The case raised difficult and important questions about how society supports struggling single mothers, particularly those facing poverty and potential homelessness. Shamaiya Hall wasn't a wealthy suburban mom like some of the others we've examined in this documentary. She was dealing with poverty, unemployment, housing insecurity, and the crushing stress of trying to provide for 5 children alone. Does that explain or excuse what she did? Absolutely not. Millions of single mothers face poverty, job loss, and housing instability without resorting to violence against their children. The vast majority of parents in desperate circumstances never harm their children, no matter how overwhelmed they feel. But while Shamaiya's circumstances don't excuse her actions, they do provide context for understanding the desperation she may have felt. They raise questions about whether more robust social support systems could prevent some cases of family violence. Child welfare advocates pointed out that there are resources available for parents in crisis, food banks that provide groceries, housing assistance programs that help prevent eviction, counseling services for families under stress, emergency childcare that gives overwhelmed parents respite. But many people don't know these resources exist, don't know how to access them, or face bureaucratic obstacles that make getting help nearly impossible when you're already in crisis. There's also significant stigma around asking for help, particularly in communities where self-reliance is valued and admitting you're struggling is seen as weakness or failure. Shamaiya may have been too proud to ask for assistance, too embarrassed to admit she couldn't provide for her children, too isolated to know where to turn. What could have prevented this tragedy? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps Shamaiya's descent into violence was inevitable regardless of available resources. Or perhaps if she had received mental health intervention earlier, if she had better financial support to prevent the crisis of potential homelessness, if she had a stronger community network of people checking on her and offering help, 3 children might still be alive and 2 others wouldn't bear the scars of their mother's attack. The surviving children will carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. They lost their siblings, the brothers and sister who should have grown up with them, shared holidays with them, been part of their lives forever. They lost their mother, not to death, but to prison, which carries its own complicated grief. They'll grow up knowing what happened, asking questions that have no satisfying answers, wondering why their mother chose violence over seeking help. If you're a parent feeling overwhelmed to the point of desperation, if you're facing poverty or homelessness with children dependent on you, if you're experiencing thoughts of harming yourself or your children, please reach out for help immediately. And if this case affected you, please leave a comment below, like this video, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files to help spread awareness about these critical issues. Case 7. Sheborah Latrice Thomas. Houston, Harris County, Texas, May 15, 2016. Harris County, home to the sprawling metropolis of Houston, the fourth largest city in the United States, has unfortunately seen more than its share of heartbreaking maternal filicide cases. The combination of Houston's massive population, significant poverty in certain areas, and strained mental health resources has created conditions where such tragedies occur with disturbing frequency. On May 15, 2016, Harris County experienced another case that shocked even a community unfortunately accustomed to violent crime. Sheborah Latrice Thomas drowned her 2 young children in a bathtub, ending their lives in the same manner that Lisa Diaz and Andrea Yates had used in their cases. The details emerged through police investigation, crime scene analysis, and Sheborah's own statements to investigators. She had been alone with her children, a 7-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter, in their residence when she made the decision to end their lives. The process of drowning children is not quick or accidental. It requires sustained action, holding a struggling child underwater while they fight for their lives, continuing even as they weaken and stop fighting. It's an intimate, prolonged form of murder that takes several minutes for each child. Sheborah filled the bathtub with water, held each child underwater until they stopped breathing, and then called 911 to report what she had done. When first responders arrived at the Houston residence, they found both children in the bathtub, their small bodies submerged in water. Paramedics immediately pulled them out and attempted resuscitation using every emergency technique available: CPR, oxygen, medications, desperate efforts to restart their hearts and breathing. But it was too late. Both children had been underwater too long, their brains deprived of oxygen beyond the point of recovery. They were pronounced dead at the scene. Sheborah was arrested immediately and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. Unlike some of the other cases we've examined, Sheborah Thomas didn't claim to hear voices or receive commands from God. She didn't exhibit obvious, clear-cut signs of psychosis like delusions or hallucinations. She didn't report seeing demons or experiencing religious visions. Instead, when questioned by investigators and later by court-appointed psychiatrists, she told them she felt her children would be better off dead than continuing to live in their current circumstances. She described feeling that she couldn't provide adequately for them, that their lives would be filled with hardship and suffering, that death was preferable to the poverty and struggle they faced. Sheborah was dealing with significant poverty, living in an economically depressed area of Houston with limited opportunities for advancement. She had unstable housing, moving frequently, never quite establishing roots or stability. She had difficulty providing basic necessities for her children: adequate food, appropriate clothing, safe living conditions. She had a documented history of depression and had expressed feelings of hopelessness to various people over the months before the drownings. She felt trapped by her circumstances, unable to see a way forward, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of single motherhood combined with poverty. On May 15, 2016, those feelings of hopelessness culminated in an irreversible, devastating decision. Rather than reach out for help, rather than contact social services or family members or mental health professionals, she chose to drown her children. The legal proceedings were relatively straightforward compared to cases involving insanity defenses. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted as part of standard procedure in capital murder cases. The mental health experts who examined Sheborah found that while she did suffer from depression, moderate to severe depression that had gone largely untreated for years, she understood the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. This is the crucial distinction in legal terms. Sheborah knew that drowning her children would kill them. She knew that killing them was illegal and morally wrong. She made a conscious choice to do it anyway, driven by depression and desperation, but not by psychosis or delusions that prevented her from understanding right from wrong. Depression, even severe depression that makes life feel unbearable, doesn't automatically constitute legal insanity. To meet the insanity standard, mental illness must be so severe that it prevents the person from knowing their actions are wrong. Simply feeling desperate or hopeless, while tragic, doesn't meet that legal threshold if the person still has the capacity to understand that killing is wrong. Sheborah ultimately decided to enter a guilty plea rather than go to trial. This was likely a strategic decision made in consultation with her defense attorneys. By pleading guilty and accepting responsibility for her actions, she could potentially avoid the death penalty. In exchange for her plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek capital punishment. She was sentenced to decades in prison, effectively a life sentence given the length of consecutive terms for 2 counts of murder. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars, confined to a Texas prison with the knowledge of what she had done to her 7-year-old son and 5-year-old daughter. In court during her sentencing hearing, Sheborah expressed remorse for what she had done. She cried as she spoke about her children, acknowledging that she had made a terrible choice, that there had been other options she could have pursued. She said she wished she could take it back, wished she had asked for help instead, wished she had made different choices. But her apologies and remorse couldn't bring back her 7-year-old son who would never reach his 8th birthday, never finish elementary school, never become a teenager, never experience any of the milestones of growing up. They couldn't bring back her 5-year-old daughter who had barely started kindergarten, who would never graduate to 1st grade, never learn to read chapter books, never grow her hair long like she'd wanted to. The case highlighted uncomfortable connections between poverty, mental health, and violence against children. Sheborah Thomas wasn't a wealthy suburban mother who snapped under the pressure of maintaining perfection. She was a struggling woman living in poverty who saw no way forward, whose depression combined with desperate circumstances created a toxic mindset where murder seemed somehow rational. It's important to emphasize again that the vast majority of parents facing poverty and depression never harm their children. Millions of single mothers struggle daily with financial stress, food insecurity, housing instability, and mental health challenges without resorting to violence. They find ways to cope. They ask for help when needed. They protect their children even when protecting themselves seems impossible. Sheborah's case represents an extreme outlier, not a predictable outcome of poverty and depression. Most people in her circumstances make different choices. They call family members, they contact social services, they visit food banks, they apply for assistance programs, they do whatever it takes to keep their children safe while finding help for themselves. Still, the case raises important questions that society must grapple with. How do we better identify parents at risk of harming their children? How do we provide accessible mental health services to those who can't afford them? How do we create robust safety nets that prevent parents from feeling so desperate that they see murder as a solution? Harris County, like many urban areas, struggles with providing adequate mental health services to low-income residents. There are long wait lists for counseling, limited psychiatric services that accept Medicaid or uninsured patients, and significant gaps in the continuum of care. Someone like Sheborah, dealing with depression but without insurance or money to pay out of pocket, would find it extremely difficult to access consistent mental health treatment. There are also cultural barriers that prevent people from seeking mental health help. In some communities, there's stigma around mental illness and therapy. People may view asking for help as weakness or may not trust the mental health system. They suffer in silence rather than reaching out for the treatment that could help them. The Harris County community where Sheborah's children died mourned 2 more young lives lost to maternal filicide. Local organizations held memorials and vigils. Schools where the children had been enrolled offered counseling to classmates and staff. Neighbors placed flowers and teddy bears outside the family's former residence, small tributes to children they may never have met, but whose deaths touched their hearts. Child welfare advocates used the case to push for better mental health resources in underserved communities, arguing that accessible depression treatment could prevent some filicides. They called for routine mental health screening in pediatric clinics, schools, and social service agencies, places where struggling parents interact with systems that could identify warning signs. Sheborah Latrice Thomas is currently serving her sentence in a Texas prison. She'll spend the rest of her life incarcerated, living every day with the knowledge of what she did to her own children. The punishment is severe, and many would say it's appropriate given the horror of her crimes. But punishment after the fact doesn't undo what happened. Her son and daughter are still dead. Their potential was still extinguished. Their lives were still stolen by the person who should have protected them above all else. The tragedy is that this was preventable. If Sheborah had received adequate treatment for her depression, regular therapy, medication if needed, consistent mental health support, she likely never would have harmed her children. If she had known about and accessed resources available to families in poverty, food assistance, housing help, emergency financial support, she might not have felt so desperately hopeless. But if doesn't change reality. 2 children are dead, and their mother is in prison, and a family has been destroyed by poverty, untreated mental illness, and a choice that can never be undone. And please, leave a comment below, hit the like button, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files so we can continue covering cases that need attention. Case 8. Oninda Romelus. Angleton, Brazoria County, Texas, January 17, 2025. This case is the most recent on our list, still making headlines as it works through the legal system, still fresh and raw in the minds of Texans who followed the story as it developed in real time just weeks ago. The wounds are still open, the investigation still ongoing, the full truth still emerging. Angleton is a small city in Brazoria County, located about 40 miles south of Houston along the Gulf Coast corridor. With a population of around 20,000 residents, Angleton serves as the county seat and maintains a slower, more community-oriented atmosphere than the sprawling Houston metropolis to the north. On January 17, 2025, less than 2 weeks ago from our current date, Brazoria County Sheriff's deputies responded to a shooting at a residence in Angleton. The call came in during the afternoon, a time when children would typically be home from school, families would be starting dinner preparations, and the day would be winding down toward evening routines. When deputies arrived at the residence, they encountered a scene of incomprehensible tragedy that would shake the Angleton community to its core. 4 children had been shot with a handgun. 2 of them, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, were already dead, their young lives ended by gunshot wounds. 2 others, ages 10 and 3, were critically wounded, fighting for their lives, suffering from gunshot injuries that required immediate emergency medical intervention. Paramedics worked frantically on the wounded children while deputies secured the scene and tried to determine what had happened. The chaos of a crime scene with multiple victims, especially child victims, is difficult to manage. Every second counts in getting the wounded to trauma care, but investigators also need to preserve evidence and establish exactly what occurred. The children's mother, 33-year-old Oninda Romelus, was present at the scene when law enforcement arrived. Initial evidence indicated she had shot all 4 of her children before calling authorities to report what she had done. The weapon, a handgun, was recovered at the residence. Oninda was immediately taken into custody and transported to the Brazoria County Jail. She was charged with 2 counts of capital murder for the deaths of the 7-year-old and 5-year-old, and 2 counts of attempted capital murder for the shooting of the 10-year-old and 3-year-old. Because the case is so extraordinarily recent, still actively being investigated and prosecuted, many details remain under seal by court order or haven't yet been released to the public. The investigation is ongoing, forensic evidence is still being processed, and the legal proceedings are in very early stages. But initial reports from law enforcement, media coverage, and court documents provided a preliminary framework of what occurred and what investigators believe led to this tragedy. Neighbors described the Romelus family as quiet and private. They didn't interact extensively with others on the street, keeping largely to themselves. But there had been no obvious signs of trouble or distress that neighbors had noticed. The family lived in a modest home in a working-class neighborhood, where people generally minded their own business, while still maintaining a sense of community awareness. The children attended local schools in the Angleton Independent School District and were described by teachers and staff as well-behaved, engaged students. They participated in class, completed their work, and seemed like typical children navigating the challenges and joys of elementary school. What drove Oninda to shoot her 4 children? Investigators are still working to answer that critical question through interviews, examination of evidence, and psychiatric evaluation. Initial statements from Oninda suggested she may have been experiencing mental health issues at the time of the shooting, though the specific nature and severity of those issues hasn't been publicly disclosed in detail. There were also indications of family stress and possible domestic problems within the household, but again, specific details remain limited as the investigation continues and the case proceeds through the court system. Investigators are examining the family's history, looking for warning signs that might have been missed, trying to understand what led to this eruption of violence. The 2 surviving children were airlifted by medical helicopter to a Level 1 trauma center in Houston, where teams of surgeons and specialists worked around the clock to save their lives and minimize long-term damage from their gunshot wounds. Gunshot injuries in young children are particularly challenging to treat. Their small bodies are more vulnerable to the impact of bullets, their organs more easily damaged, their recovery more uncertain. As of the latest updates available, both surviving children were expected to survive physically, though they faced long roads to recovery, including multiple surgeries, extensive rehabilitation, and ongoing medical care. But their physical recovery, while critically important, is only part of the challenge they'll face. The psychological trauma of being shot by their own mother, of witnessing their siblings being killed, of experiencing that level of violence and betrayal from the person who should be their ultimate protector. That trauma will require years of intensive therapy and support. These children will need specialized trauma counseling, possibly medication for PTSD symptoms, and extraordinary care from whatever family members step up to raise them. They lost 2 of their siblings, brothers or sisters who should have grown up alongside them, shared rooms with them, fought and played and laughed with them throughout childhood. They lost their mother, not to death but to arrest and prosecution. They lost their family structure, their home, their sense of safety in the world. The Angleton community rallied around the surviving children in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. Community members organized fundraisers to help with mounting medical expenses, which can quickly reach hundreds of thousands of dollars for trauma care, surgeries, rehabilitation, and ongoing treatment. Local churches collected donations of clothing, toys, and necessities for the children once they were released from the hospital. Counselors were made available to classmates and friends of the Romelus children who were struggling to process the trauma. When children learn that their friends have been shot by their mother, that 2 of them died, it shakes their fundamental sense of safety in the world. They need help understanding what happened, processing their grief and fear, and rebuilding trust that the adults in their lives will protect them. Vigils were held for the 2 children who died, with community members gathering to light candles, share memories, and grieve together. In small communities like Angleton, these tragedies affect everyone. The victims' classmates, teachers, neighbors, and even people who never met the family feel the ripple effects of such violence. Oninda Romelus remains in custody at the Brazoria County Jail, held without bond given the severity of the charges against her. She faces 2 counts of capital murder, which carry potential sentences of either life in prison without parole or death by execution. Given that her alleged victims were her own children, one only 5 years old, the other 7, prosecutors may very well seek the death penalty. The question of her mental state at the time of the shootings will undoubtedly be central to her defense strategy. Court-appointed attorneys will have her evaluated by psychiatric experts to determine whether she was experiencing psychosis, severe depression, or other mental illness that might constitute an insanity defense or mitigating factor in sentencing. Was she experiencing acute psychosis that prevented her from understanding the wrongfulness of her actions? Was she depressed to the point of psychotic features? Or was she a mother who made an unthinkable choice while still understanding that shooting her children was wrong? These questions will be answered through extensive psychiatric evaluations, witness testimony, examination of her medical and mental health history, and evidence presented in court. But regardless of the legal outcome, the fundamental tragedy remains unchanged. 2 children are dead, 2 others are traumatized survivors, and a family is destroyed. The case has reignited discussions about gun safety, particularly in homes with children. How did Oninda access the firearm she used? Was it properly secured in a gun safe, or was it easily accessible? Were there trigger locks or other safety devices that might have prevented its use? Could better gun storage laws have prevented this tragedy? Texas has relatively permissive gun laws and doesn't require firearms to be stored in any particular way, even in homes with children. Gun rights advocates argue that responsible gun ownership is a personal choice and that new laws wouldn't prevent someone determined to commit violence from accessing a weapon. Gun safety advocates counter that secure storage requirements could prevent some impulsive acts of violence, particularly by people experiencing mental health crises. These policy debates will continue as the Oninda Romelus case proceeds through the legal system, with both sides pointing to the case as evidence supporting their positions. For now, the Brazoria County community mourns 2 young lives lost and prays for the recovery of 2 wounded children. The beautiful innocence of childhood was shattered for 4 children on January 17, 2025. 2 of them will never have the chance to recover. 2 others face long, difficult paths toward healing. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Case 9, Marcella Williams. Arlington, Tarrant County, Texas, December 2004. Arlington, situated directly between Dallas and Fort Worth in the heart of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, is Texas's 50th largest city, home to hundreds of thousands of residents and known for family-friendly attractions like Six Flags Amusement Park and the former home of the Texas Rangers baseball team. In December 2004, one household in Arlington became the scene of a slow, horrifying crime that would shock even investigators who had seen decades of child abuse cases. This wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, a momentary loss of control, or an act committed during a psychotic episode. This was systematic, prolonged torture masked as discipline, extending over months or possibly years. 9-year-old Davontae Williams died on December 7, 2004. But he didn't die suddenly from acute injury or in a violent attack. He died from extreme malnutrition and neglect. Essentially, he starved to death under his mother's care. When emergency responders were finally called to the Arlington home, they found Davontae's emaciated body, so thin and wasted that it barely resembled a 9-year-old child. He weighed only 35 pounds when he should have weighed around 70 pounds for his age and height. His body showed signs of prolonged starvation, muscle wasting, protruding bones, sunken eyes, organ failure. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. Davontae hadn't simply been undernourished or experiencing food insecurity. He had been systematically starved over an extended period while others in the household ate normally. He had been deliberately denied food as a form of punishment or abuse while his siblings and mother had access to adequate nutrition. Investigators would later learn through interviews and evidence gathered from the home that Davontae had been locked in a closet for extended periods, sometimes days at a time. He was isolated from the rest of the family, kept in darkness, denied the basic necessities of food, water, and human contact. He was beaten when he begged for food or tried to sneak something to eat. He was subjected to cruelty that defied comprehension. Medical experts testified that his death was the result of prolonged starvation and severe neglect. It wasn't an accident, wasn't a case of poverty preventing the family from buying enough food. This was intentional, targeted abuse of one specific child while others in the same household were adequately fed. Davontae's mother, Marcella Williams, was responsible for his care and for the systematic abuse that killed him. She lived with Davontae and several other children in what appeared from the outside to be a normal home in an ordinary Arlington neighborhood. No one looking at the house from the street would suspect the horror occurring inside. Investigators attempted to understand why Davontae was singled out for such extreme abuse while his siblings were spared. This selective targeting is seen in some child abuse cases, where one child becomes the scapegoat or target while others in the family are treated normally or even well. Theories suggested that Marcella may have blamed Davontae for problems in her life. Perhaps he reminded her of someone she resented. Perhaps she perceived him as more difficult or challenging than her other children. Perhaps some twisted psychology led her to see him as deserving punishment while the others were innocent. The exact reasoning may never be fully understood because the psychology behind such selective cruelty is complex and disturbing. When investigators examined the home and interviewed the other children who had lived there, the full scope of Davontae's suffering became clear. He had been isolated for months, kept separate from his siblings, denied participation in family activities or meals. The other children had been told not to speak to him, not to share food with him, not to question why he was being treated differently. This created a household where child abuse occurred in plain sight of other children, who were themselves traumatized by witnessing their brother's suffering, but too young and powerless to intervene. The psychological impact on Davontae's siblings, watching their brother slowly starve while being forbidden to help him, would require years of therapy to process. The case raised critical questions about how such severe abuse could go unnoticed for so long. Davontae had attended elementary school in the Arlington Independent School District. Teachers had seen him regularly until several months before his death. Didn't they notice when he stopped attending school? Didn't they follow up when he disappeared from class? This was before many of the strengthened attendance tracking systems currently in place. At the time, when a child stopped attending school, the response varied by district and individual school. Sometimes families were contacted, sometimes truancy proceedings were initiated, but sometimes children simply fell through the cracks. Marcella had told school officials that Davontae had moved to live with relatives in another state, a plausible explanation that satisfied the school's inquiries. No one demanded proof. No one insisted on speaking directly to the relatives supposedly caring for Davontae. No one followed up to ensure the story was true. Relatives who occasionally saw the family noticed they never saw Davontae anymore. But Marcella had ready excuses. He was at a friend's house. He was visiting other family members. He was in his room sleeping. The excuses were accepted without serious questioning. No one demanded to actually see Davontae, to verify he was okay. Neighbors said they had noticed that one of Marcella's children seemed to have disappeared from the usual activities, playing outside, getting on the school bus, being visible around the neighborhood. But they assumed he had moved away or was staying elsewhere. People noticed, but no one took the critical step of calling Child Protective Services or demanding answers. This is one of the most tragic aspects of Davontae's case. He needed just one person to ask hard questions, to demand proof that he was okay, to refuse to accept vague excuses and insist on seeing him. But no one did. And so he suffered alone, starving in darkness, until his small body could endure no more. Marcella Williams was arrested and charged with capital murder once the full extent of her abuse was discovered and documented. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. Davontae's physical condition spoke for itself. No child reaches that state of emaciation through accident or neglect alone. This was intentional, systematic abuse resulting in death. Medical experts testified about the timeline of starvation, explaining that Davontae's condition had developed over months. They described the physical and psychological suffering he would have experienced as his body slowly consumed itself, unable to function without adequate nutrition. The testimony was difficult for everyone in the courtroom to hear. During the investigation and trial, disturbing details continued to emerge about the conditions of Davontae's confinement and the abuse he suffered. Evidence showed he had been kept in a small closet with inadequate ventilation, no bathroom access, and only occasional, insufficient food. The cruelty was methodical and sustained. The prosecution presented an airtight case. There was no way to explain away the physical evidence of prolonged starvation. There was no defense that could justify keeping a child locked in a closet while denying him food. There was no mental illness evaluation that would excuse such systematic torture. Marcella Williams ultimately pleaded guilty to capital murder, likely recognizing that a trial would result in conviction and potentially a death sentence. By pleading guilty and accepting responsibility, at least legally, she was able to negotiate a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty. In court during her sentencing, Marcella showed limited emotion or remorse. She offered no real explanation for why she had targeted Davontae, why she had starved him while feeding her other children, why she had allowed him to suffer so terribly. Her silence on these questions left everyone, investigators, prosecutors, the judge, the public, without answers to the fundamental question, how could a mother do this to her own child? Davontae Williams was buried in Arlington. At the time of his death, he was 9 years old, though his malnourished body resembled that of a much younger child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. He had spent the final months or perhaps years of his life in darkness, hunger, pain, and isolation, crying out for help that never came, suffering alone while the world went about its business unaware. At his funeral, attended by social workers, advocates, and community members who had never met him but were moved by his story, mourners grieved not just for Davontae, but for the failure of systems and people to protect him. Everyone who had contact with the family, teachers, neighbors, relatives, carried some degree of guilt for not acting, not questioning, not demanding to see Davontae when he disappeared from view. The case led to significant reforms in how Texas tracks school attendance and follows up on children who stop attending without clear explanation. New policies required more rigorous verification of claims that children had moved or transferred schools. Training was enhanced for school personnel on recognizing and reporting signs of abuse and neglect. Child welfare advocates used Davontae's case to push for stronger mandatory reporting requirements and better education for community members about their responsibility to report suspected abuse. They emphasized that suspecting abuse creates a legal and moral obligation to call authorities, not to investigate yourself or wait for absolute proof. Marcella Williams remains incarcerated in a Texas women's prison, serving her life sentence without possibility of parole. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, isolated from society, just as she had isolated her son. The other children in her custody were removed and placed in foster care, eventually adopted by families who could provide the love, safety, and care they deserved. Davontae's death was entirely, completely preventable. If even one person had taken action when they noticed he had disappeared from view, if a teacher had demanded proof of his transfer to another school, if a neighbor had called CPS to report concerns, if a relative had insisted on seeing him rather than accepting excuses, he might have been rescued. Instead, he died alone, starved and neglected by the person who should have nurtured him. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, if you notice unexplained injuries, dramatic weight loss, a child who seems fearful or withdrawn, a child who disappears from normal activities without clear explanation, you don't need proof of abuse to make a report. Suspicion is enough. Trained investigators will follow up on your report and determine whether intervention is needed. Your call could save a child's life. Don't assume someone else will make the report be the person who acts. Be the voice for a child who cannot speak for themselves. Please take a moment to leave a thoughtful comment below. Share this video to raise awareness about crimes against children, and make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Silent Files so you can stay informed. Case 10, Saiqa Akhter. Irving, Dallas County, Texas, July 20th, 2010. Irving, a diverse city in the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex with a significant immigrant population from around the world, prides itself on its multiculturalism and welcoming atmosphere. The city is home to large communities of residents from South Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and many other regions, creating a rich cultural tapestry. On July 20th, 2010, Irving became the site of another heartbreaking case of maternal filicide when Saiqa Akhter, a 30-year-old mother originally from Pakistan, strangled her 5-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter to death in the family's apartment. The tragedy unfolded during what should have been an ordinary summer day. Saiqa's husband was at work, earning money to support the family as the sole breadwinner. Saiqa was home with their 2 young children in their modest apartment in an Irving residential complex. What happened during those hours when Saiqa was alone with her son and daughter would devastate multiple families and highlight critical issues around mental health, cultural stigma, and the particular vulnerabilities of immigrant women dealing with postpartum depression. When Saiqa's husband returned home from work that evening, he found a scene of incomprehensible horror. His 2 children were dead, killed in their own bedrooms in the place they should have been safest. Saiqa was in the apartment in a state of extreme distress, her mental state clearly disturbed. Emergency services were called immediately. Police arrived to find the devastating scene: a 5-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl, both strangled to death. Saiqa was arrested at the scene and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. During initial questioning by investigators, Saiqa made statements that immediately raised serious concerns about her mental state and suggested severe mental illness. She told detectives that her children had been a burden to her, that she couldn't handle the overwhelming stress of motherhood, that they would be better off dead than continuing to live. But she also exhibited clear signs of severe depression and possible psychosis that warranted immediate psychiatric evaluation. Her statements weren't entirely coherent. Her affect was disturbed. Her explanations for why she had killed her children suggested distorted thinking patterns consistent with major mental illness. As the case proceeded through the criminal justice system, mental health evaluations revealed an increasingly complex picture of Saiqa's psychological state. She had been suffering from severe postpartum depression following the birth of her daughter 2 years earlier, depression that had never been adequately diagnosed or treated. In Pakistani culture, as in many South Asian and immigrant communities, there is significant stigma surrounding mental illness. Mental health problems are often seen as personal weakness, moral failing, or even spiritual corruption rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. Seeking help from a psychiatrist or therapist can bring shame to the individual and family. This cultural stigma may have prevented Saiqa from recognizing her own symptoms as mental illness or from seeking help even if she did recognize something was wrong. In her community, admitting to depression or seeking psychiatric treatment might have been seen as unacceptable, bringing dishonor to her family. Cultural factors also played a significant role in Saiqa's experience of motherhood. She felt intense pressure to be a perfect mother and wife according to traditional Pakistani cultural expectations. When she struggled with the demands of caring for 2 young children, when she didn't feel the constant joy and fulfillment that cultural narratives promised, she internalized that struggle as personal failure. Rather than understanding that many mothers struggle, that postpartum depression is a common medical condition affecting millions of women regardless of culture or background, Saiqa believed something was fundamentally wrong with her as a person. This self-blame and shame likely prevented her from reaching out for help. The combination of untreated mental illness, cultural pressure, and social isolation created a perfect storm of risk factors. Saiqa was far from her extended family support network in Pakistan. She may have had limited English language skills, making it difficult to access mental health services even if she had wanted to. She may not have known that postpartum depression is treatable, that help was available, that what she was experiencing was a medical condition rather than personal failure. Psychiatric experts who evaluated Saiqa after her arrest diagnosed her with major depressive disorder with psychotic features. This is a serious mental illness where depression becomes so severe that it includes psychotic symptoms like delusions or hallucinations. At the time she killed her children, experts determined Saiqa was experiencing delusions related to her depression. She believed her children were suffering and would continue to suffer throughout their lives. In her distorted perception shaped by psychotic depression, killing them was an act of mercy that would end their suffering and her own. This delusional thinking is characteristic of psychotic depression. The person's perception of reality becomes so warped by the illness that they genuinely believe things that are objectively false. Saiqa's belief that her children would be better off dead, that killing them was somehow protective or merciful, was a symptom of her psychosis rather than a rational conclusion. The legal question became whether Saiqa met the standard for legal insanity. Had her mental illness prevented her from understanding that killing her children was wrong? Or had she known it was wrong but done it anyway due to depression and cultural pressure? Multiple psychiatric experts testified at her trial that Saiqa's psychosis was severe enough that she couldn't appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions at the time she strangled her son and daughter. She genuinely believed, in her delusional state, that she was protecting them from a lifetime of suffering. Her delusions were complete and all-consuming, controlling her perception of reality entirely. The trial took place in 2011 in Dallas County. The prosecution presented the undisputed facts of the case. Saiqa Akhter had strangled her 5-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter to death in their apartment. The physical evidence was clear, and Saiqa's own statements confirmed what she had done. The defense argued that while the facts weren't in dispute, Saiqa had been legally insane at the time of the murders, unable to distinguish right from wrong due to psychotic depression. They presented extensive expert testimony about her mental state, the cultural factors that prevented her from seeking help, and the nature of psychotic delusions. The jury heard testimony about postpartum depression, how it can escalate to psychotic depression if left untreated, and how cultural stigma around mental illness creates barriers to treatment. They learned about the particular vulnerabilities of immigrant women who may be isolated from support systems, unfamiliar with mental health resources, and carrying cultural shame about admitting struggles. After hearing all the evidence and deliberating on the complex questions before them, the jury returned a verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Saiqa was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for treatment rather than sentenced to prison. The verdict was controversial within the community. Some people felt justice hadn't been served, that Saiqa should have been held criminally responsible for killing 2 innocent children regardless of her mental state. Others believed the verdict was appropriate and compassionate, recognizing that severe mental illness had driven her actions and that treatment rather than punishment was the right response. Saiqa's husband faced impossible, devastating grief. He had lost both his children in the most horrible way imaginable. His wife, the mother of his children, was their killer. He had to reconcile his loss with his understanding that mental illness had destroyed his family. In statements to media and in court, he expressed both profound grief for his children and a complex mixture of feelings toward his wife. He acknowledged that he had noticed Saiqa struggling in the months and years before the murders, but he hadn't fully understood the severity of her mental illness or known how to help her. The family, both in Irving and in Pakistan, struggled with the tragedy from multiple perspectives. There was grief for the children, shock at what Saiqa had done, and difficult conversations within the Pakistani community about mental health, cultural expectations, and whether anything could have been done differently. The case brought significant attention to mental health stigma in immigrant communities and the particular vulnerabilities of immigrant women dealing with postpartum mental illness. Advocates emphasized several critical points. First, postpartum depression and psychosis don't discriminate based on nationality, religion, ethnicity, or culture. These are medical conditions that can affect any woman who gives birth, regardless of background. Second, cultural stigma around mental illness creates dangerous barriers to treatment. When seeking help is seen as shameful or weak, people suffer in silence until their conditions become severe or even life-threatening. Third, mental health services need to be culturally sensitive and accessible to immigrant communities. This means providing services in multiple languages, understanding cultural contexts that shape how people experience and express mental illness, and actively working to reduce stigma. Fourth, community education is essential. Religious leaders, community elders, and cultural organizations need to provide accurate information about mental health, emphasize that seeking treatment is appropriate and necessary, and create environments where people feel safe admitting they need help. Organizations serving the Pakistani and Muslim communities in Irving and across Texas use Saiqa's case as a catalyst for mental health education and outreach. Imams spoke from pulpits about the importance of mental health care. Community health fairs included mental health screening and information. Culturally specific support groups were created for women experiencing postpartum depression. Saiqa Akhter remained in psychiatric care for years, receiving intensive treatment for her psychotic depression. Reports from mental health professionals indicated that with proper medication and therapy, her psychosis resolved and she gained devastating insight into what she had done. This recovery brought its own terrible burden. Once the psychosis cleared and Saiqa could think clearly again, she had to live with the knowledge that she had strangled her own children to death. The grief, guilt, and remorse were crushing. She required ongoing intensive therapy not just for the original depression, but for the trauma of having committed such acts while mentally ill. The legal system had determined she was not criminally responsible due to insanity, but that finding didn't erase her actions or absolve her of the emotional weight. She would carry that burden for the rest of her life. Her 5-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter were buried according to Islamic tradition in services attended by family members and community members who grieved both for the children and for the tragedy of mental illness destroying a family. The children had barely begun their lives, the 5-year-old just starting to experience school, friendships, and independence, the 2-year-old still a toddler discovering the world. The Irving community, home to a large and diverse population including many Pakistani and Muslim families, mourned the loss while grappling with difficult conversations about mental health and cultural expectations. Religious and community leaders emphasized that mental illness is not a moral failing, not a punishment from God, not something to be ashamed of. It's a medical condition that requires medical treatment. The case remains a painful but important reminder that mental health care must be accessible to everyone regardless of cultural background, immigration status, or language. Barriers to care, whether financial, cultural, linguistic, or logistical, can have deadly consequences. If you're from a community where mental illness is stigmatized or misunderstood, please know that seeking help for depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions is an act of courage and responsibility, not weakness or shame. Mental illness is a medical condition like diabetes or heart disease. It requires treatment, and treatment works. Your mental health matters regardless of what cultural messages you may have received. There are culturally sensitive mental health providers who understand your background and can provide appropriate care. If you're struggling with postpartum depression or any other mental health issue, please reach out for help today. You deserve treatment and support, and your family needs you healthy and well. We've examined 10 devastating cases of maternal filicide in Texas, spanning from 1996 to 2025. Each case is unique, each tragic in its own way, yet they share common threads that deserve our attention and understanding. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths about mental illness, poverty, cultural stigma, systemic failures, and the reality that sometimes evil exists even in the most unexpected places. They challenge our assumptions about motherhood, about family safety, about the communities we live in. Let's reflect on what we've learned. Mental illness is real, devastating, and treatable, but only if we recognize it and provide accessible care. Cases like Deanna Laney, Lisa Diaz, Melissa Towne, and Saiqa Akhter demonstrate how untreated psychosis or severe depression can lead to tragedy. These women weren't evil monsters. They were sick people who needed help they didn't receive until it was too late. Their children paid the ultimate price for mental health systems that failed to identify and treat serious illness. Poverty and desperation create dangerous situations, especially when combined with mental health issues. Shamaiya Hall and Sheborah Thomas faced overwhelming financial stress, potential homelessness, and limited support systems. While millions of parents face similar circumstances without harming their children, we must acknowledge that desperation can contribute to risk. Society has an obligation to provide safety nets that prevent families from falling into such desperate situations. Cultural factors matter. Saiqa Akhter's case illustrated how cultural stigma around mental illness can prevent people from seeking help they desperately need. Mental health awareness and services must be culturally sensitive and accessible to all communities. Not all maternal filicide is driven by mental illness. Cases like Kimberly Trenor and Darlie Routier, if the jury verdict was correct, represent something different: calculated cruelty, resentment of children, or prioritization of self over maternal responsibility. These cases remind us that while mental illness explains many filicides, some are committed by people who simply made evil choices. Child protection systems have gaps that must be addressed. Davontae Williams starved to death while multiple systems, schools, neighbors, relatives, failed to act on warning signs. His death was preventable if even one person had asked hard questions and demanded answers. Early intervention saves lives. In nearly every case we examined, there were warning signs before the tragedy: changes in behavior, increasing religious extremism, worsening depression, financial crisis, social isolation. If these signs had been recognized and intervention provided, children might still be alive. The children we've discussed today, Riley and Sawyers, Devin and Damon Routier, Joshua and Luke Laney, Christina and Brianna Diaz, Melissa Towne's 5-year-old daughter, Shamaiya Hall's 3 children, Sheborah Thomas's 2 children, Oninda Romelus's 2 youngest, Davontae Williams, and Saiqa Akhter's son and daughter, all deserve to grow up. They deserve to experience first days of school and last days of summer vacation. They deserve birthday parties and holidays with family. They deserve to discover their talents and passions. They deserve to fall in love, to pursue careers, to have children of their own someday. They deserved full lives filled with joy, challenges, growth, and love. Instead, their lives were stolen by the very people who brought them into the world. Some were killed by mothers experiencing psychosis so severe they couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. Others were killed by mothers who made conscious choices driven by resentment, desperation, or cruelty. But regardless of the circumstances, the outcome is the same. Children are dead, families are destroyed, communities are traumatized. As we close this documentary, remember that if you see signs of child abuse, unexplained injuries, behavioral changes, children who seem fearful or withdrawn, dramatic weight loss, parents who isolate their children or give inconsistent explanations. You have a moral and often legal obligation to report it. If you know someone struggling with mental health issues, hearing voices, experiencing delusions, severely depressed, exhibiting concerning behavioral changes, help them get professional evaluation and treatment. If you're struggling yourself with dark thoughts, overwhelming stress, depression, psychosis, thoughts of harming yourself or others, reach out for help immediately. Mental health crises are medical emergencies that require immediate intervention. One phone call could save a life. One conversation could prevent a tragedy. One person asking the right questions could rescue a child from abuse. For True Crime Silent Files, thank you for watching this difficult but important examination of maternal filicide in Texas. These cases remind us that justice, mental health care, child protection, and community awareness must remain priorities in our society. Awareness prevents tragedies. Intervention saves lives. Your voice matters. If this documentary affected you or provided valuable information, please like this video so more people can find it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts respectfully. These cases deserve serious discussion about how we can better protect children and support struggling parents. And please hit the subscribe button for more true crime content from True Crime Silent Files. We bring you the stories that need to be told, the cases that demand attention, and the truth that can't be ignored. Remember, every child deserves protection. Every person struggling with mental illness deserves treatment. Every family facing crisis deserves support. We all have a role to play in creating a society where tragedies like these become increasingly rare. Stay vigilant. Stay compassionate. Stay informed. And most importantly, act when you see warning signs. Don't assume someone else will make the call, file the report, or offer help. Be the person who takes action. Be the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Until next time, this is True Crime Silent Files, bringing you the stories that need to be told, honoring victims by ensuring their stories are heard, and working toward a future where children are safe and families have the support they need.